Professor of who is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Pennsylvania, where he directs the Socio-Spatial Climate Collaborative and co-directs the Climate and Community Project. He's a prolific author. He's co-author of A Planet to Win, Why We Need a Green New Deal through Verso books. And it received absolutely fantastic reviews in the New York Review of Books, Foreign Policy, the Los Angeles Review of Books, Science for the People, and elsewhere. He's currently completing a book project called Street Fight, Climate Change and Inequality in the 21st Century, which is under contract with Princeton University Press. And his research centers on the politics of climate change, investigating the intersections of climate change, housing, political economy, social movements, and inequalities of race and class in the US and Brazil. And aside from his sort of academic writings, he's appeared in Nature, Environmental Politics, Public Culture, the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research, City, Analysis, Urban Change, Theory, Action, just too many to be, well, actually, I'm going to put in it as well, The Guardian, The Nation, and Jacobin, because I think this also highlights his political, the political orientation of a lot of his research. And today we're really pleased to have him speak on Follow the Carbon, Housing and Climate Change in the Age of the Green New Deal. As usual, please microphones off and send your prolific UEP questions to Daniel. He's going to speak for about 30 minutes and I'll moderate the chat after that. So Daniel, thanks for being here virtually. Over to you.
Great. Julian, thank you so much for the extremely kind introduction. And I'm thrilled to be here talking to the notorious geniuses at Tufts. So please spare me your most brutal questions. And let's get to it. So what I want to basically argue today is that following the carbon or paying close attention to carbon emissions doesn't have to distract us from broader social, economic, political struggles for justice, but on the contrary, it can actually help us see those struggles in a new light and sort of an almost obsessive focus on carbon, but in an intersectional way can be a very powerful tool, again, for intersectional analysis and also for progressive policy. And I'll cash that out as we go. There's a sort of broad orientation, and I'll come back to it, around the idea of the Green New Deal and the idea of even a Green New Deal for housing. But before we get there, let's just start, and the Green New Deal for Public Housing Act, let's just start with some basics. Nothing will change urban life in the 21st century more than carbon. Both the impacts of carbon emissions in terms of extreme weather and the changes that we make to decarbonize society will transform urban life and could go in any number of directions. If you look at the basic projections of emissions and temperatures, only a radical reduction in carbon emissions can give us a decent chance at a livable planet. At the same time, we know that in the long term, carbon will have a very powerful effect. It will shape the weather for far longer into the future than we are now from Stonehenge in the past. And we can think even by the end of this century, the difference between a high carbon and a low carbon pathway is enormous. In Shanghai, there are 10 million people who currently live on land that could be underwater by the end of the century if we have 4 degrees Celsius warming, a high warming scenario, versus 2 degrees Celsius warming. So there is kind of everything to fight for. The question then becomes, what can a critical social science of climate change do? How should we think about urban life in the 21st century with an eye to action, knowing what the situation is with climate change? And my argument in brief is that we need to think about root causes of our social, economic, and political problems. And we need to embrace a kind of carbon absolutism, which is just to say that we really need to learn to follow the carbon and to see carbon in all manner of social struggles. And I'm going to talk today in particular about how that relates to fights around urban density, or even just more broadly, let's say the urban form. And we're going to start in Sao Paulo. Sao Paulo is where I started my fieldwork for my dissertation about 10 years ago. And my fieldwork in Sao Paulo taught me to see carbon and social struggles in a very different way. So Sao Paulo is the economic capital of Latin America. It has about 20 million inhabitants. It is an extremely dense and built up city in the central regions, but it is also a city of enormous inequality. This is probably the most famous image of Sao Paulo. Balconies, each one with a swimming pool in Morumbi, right next to the favela Paraisópolis, just a fence separating these two extremes of wealth and disinvestment. And Sao Paulo is, despite the dense built up downtown, for the most part, a sprawling city, much like cities all across the Americas. Dense development in central areas, but otherwise quite sprawling, a car-dependent city. And Sao Paulo is a city of social struggle. So let me introduce one person who's played a major role in shaping politics in downtown Sao Paulo. Her name is Ivanete Araújo. She is a Black woman in her 40s and a mother. She was born, like many lower-income residents of Sao Paulo, outside the city. She was born and raised in the rural regions of Sao Paulo state. One of her first jobs was as a sugarcane cutter. So she cut sugarcane that was then used to create ethanol, a non-fossil fuel source of fuel for cars. So some would call this a green job, but in practice it is backbreaking labor that in Brazil has often been done under slave-like conditions. And there's numerous reports on this. So Ivanete did not want to stay in that job. She had a couple of children. She had a partner. They moved to downtown Sao Paulo. And she got work as a domestic, a live-in maid in a wealthy family. In the apartment that she lived in, the room that she lived in the apartment where she worked, was so humid, it was full of mold and terrible for her health. And she asked her employer, who was also her landlord, if she could have a raise so that she could rent her own apartment nearby her workplace. And instead, the owner of that property told her that she could pack her bags and leave. And so her entire family moved onto the streets of Sao Paulo for months, until finally they were contacted by Sao Paulo's housing movement. This was in the early to mid 2000s. Sao Paulo's housing movement was on the rise, and they were recruiting people to squat in abandoned buildings in the downtown central area and to use those squats, those occupations, to pressure the city government and the national government to transform those abandoned buildings into public affordable housing. So Ivanete was at first reluctant. She told me that it was actually her husband who convinced her to finally go to these meetings, which is a bit unusual. For the most part, Sao Paulo's housing movement consists of and is led by women and women of color. But she eventually went along, and she became sort of quickly a leader in this housing movement. And in 2007, she participated in the occupation of this building pictured here called Mauá. They entered the building. Normally when the housing movement will occupy a vacant building, they'll break the chains, go into the building, and immediately the police will try to stop them. But on this day, for some reason, the police arrived 2 hours late. And Ivanete told me that it was the most peaceful break-in and occupation of a building she'd ever experienced. And she's been living in that building ever since. The picture you see here shows people meeting on the ground floor here. And this is important. The building that Ivanete occupied and became the leader of that occupation became the kind of nerve center for all the downtown progressive politics in Sao Paulo in the 2000s. All kinds of progressive city planners, intellectuals, housing movements, union workers would meet and strategize for progressive policies in downtown Sao Paulo in the 2000s and beyond. The problem was that this squat was threatened by climate change, but it wasn't threatened by climate change in the form of extreme weather. It was threatened by a plan to decarbonize Sao Paulo on the basis of a kind of pro-middle class green redevelopment, something that I think Julian might call greenlining, actually. So the plan put forth by a neoliberal sort of center-right mayor in the late 2000s was called Nova Luz, a new light, and it was to turn downtown Sao Paulo into something resembling Barcelona or Paris. There's no facial features down here, so that's a problem. But they wanted to do this green redevelopment, and the idea was they would make a beautiful, walkable, elite-driven downtown They would have a lot of housing. They would have companies like IBM move in, post-industrial paradise, and that this green downtown redevelopment would lower carbon emissions by increasing walkability, and it would teach the rest of Sao Paulo that it would desire to ultimately have walkable neighborhoods without cars. And so it was a kind of like trickle out form of elite urban greening. The problem, of course, is that the area that they wanted to transform, this underinvested area in the inner city of Sao Paulo, much like many inner cities in the US have been, is that it wasn't exactly a land without a people. It was a neighborhood full of militant housing movements, squatting abandoned buildings, and revitalizing the downtown in their own way. This area that's sort of in color is where the area that was supposed to be redeveloped to be called Nova Luz, a new light, and the star is where the housing occupation was. And the members of the housing occupation fought very hard to prevent this downtown redevelopment. I'll skip ahead here. And so you ended up with actually a fight between urban environmentalists who were on the one hand saying, yes, the environmentalism demands this green redevelopment, and housing movements who are saying, no, we want this to be a downtown for working class people, public housing, cultural services, mixed income, and democratically decided. And indeed, although the housing movements were not themselves talking about, for instance, decarbonization, when you look closely, you realize that they're actually talking about a very similar agenda to the environmentalists. The housing movements are also talking about land use and housing and transit and buildings, things you all know are essential to decarbonizing the city, but they were talking about it from the perspective of social justice and not from the perspective of climate change. And indeed, what ultimately happened was that the plan to redevelop downtown, the green redevelopment scheme from the center-right, the neoliberals, was actually defeated in an election in 2012. And the housing movement instead would support a plan from the Workers' Party to redevelop the city, not just the downtown, but to create corridors of densification, basically transit-oriented development, all across the city. And this time the housing movement fought successfully to ensure that there would be affordable housing built all along all of these corridors of densification. So you had the housing movement on the one hand successfully resisting a green redevelopment that would only benefit middle and upper middle class people. And they would then seem to be in opposition to decarbonizing the city through densification. But when you had another political regime in place, suddenly now the housing movement is in support. And it's not just that they were in support in an abstract way. In order to create these corridors of densification and to build affordable housing all alongside them, the progressive mayor needed city council to go along and needed to essentially force real estate industry in Sao Paulo to swallow the imposition of a lot more affordable housing than the real estate industry wanted. So what happened? The mayor of the city then, the Workers' Party mayor, Fernando Haddad, called on the housing movement to go to city council and pressure the city council to vote for this plan to create density plus affordable housing. And this is what happened. The housing movement went in front of the city council and they burnt tires in a big, massive protest. This is not what you would imagine a pro-urban environment protest looking like in an American or even in a Latin American city. And you will not see here any green banners for the environment. These are the red banners of the housing movement. And yet the actual substantive result of this protest was that the city did vote to adopt the master plan, which has been creating more density along Sao Paulo's transit corridors and has actually increased the adoption of buses, which are traveling more quickly and burning less diesel. And what's more, one of the elements of this plan is to take a fee that developers pay to build high density and to use that fee to channel it into buying back social housing, to buying abandoned buildings and converting them into social housing downtown where people, working class people, can walk to work. So that very same occupation that I showed you successfully now has had their building bought out from the delinquent landlord, is being turned into social housing downtown. So that the last time that I met Ivaneci, it was a much happier story. And here she is in the kind of childcare center of this housing occupation, which is now publicly owned, and meant to show you that the vision here is not just homes in the downtown, but indeed a sophisticated vision of homes and social services and care centers a real rich and full way of life for working people in downtown areas, so that working class people and very poor people have the same access to density and to walkability as anyone else. So what's the upshot then of what I'm saying here about Sao Paulo? It's that if you follow the carbon into the viscera of social life, if you don't think that environmentalists are only people who talk about the environment, but you look at the implications of what they're doing, you realize that actually everybody is a climate actor, whether they talk about climate change or not. You realize that substantively, objectively, housing movements in places like Sao Paulo that are fighting for working class access, for people of color to have access to downtown walkable neighborhoods. And those same movements are actually fighting to bring density and public transit and walkability to the entire city. Then those housing movements are climate protagonists, even if they don't talk about climate change or don't talk about it often. Now, they do sometimes talk about climate change. These housing movements understand that what they're doing is good for the climate, but for the most part, they don't. Nevertheless, they are climate actors. You won't often find housing movements discussed as urban climate actors in textbooks on urban climate policy, but they are, and often in very powerful ways for good. And so, to borrow for some Twitter language, I think we need to move beyond a kind of tired vision, which is that there is a contrast, a conflict between local social justice concerns and elite global climate concerns. And instead, the more wired view is that there is a rivalry, a contest between, on the one hand, luxury ecological projects that are fundamentally about creating green cities for the upper middle class, for the professional class, versus democratic ecology projects, which is where housing movements and other social justice movements are fighting for a more fair and equitable and just city that also has ecological implications. And in some cases, as I'll show you in a minute, arguably far more ecological implications, that the working class vision of social housing anchoring dense neighborhoods could actually be lower carbon than the kind of green redevelopment agenda that's often proposed by neoliberals or the center right. I'll note quickly that as time passes in Sao Paulo, the housing movement is increasingly embracing an explicit environmental agenda. I went to visit, for instance, new social housing being constructed in the suburbs of Sao Paulo, the industrial suburbs, by a group. They're calling this complex the Nelson Mandela and Frei Tetu complex, in homage to Nelson Mandela and to a very left-wing Catholic priest in Brazil. And this housing occupation has worked very hard to build ties with the landless peasants movement, the MST in Brazil. Here we're seeing people visiting their future social housing. So from the outside, just looks like your standard social housing tower. But even in their iconography, when they talk about the importance of building these new apartment towers, that in Portuguese they call it uma conquista, to kind of win new social housing, they're putting it in kind of visual and aesthetic dialogue with the idea of nature, right? For the housing movement increasingly in Sao Paulo, these kind of seemingly gray developments of just standard social housing are still part of a broader project of ordinary people controlling access to land and doing it in a way that has more relationship with nature. And in this case in particular, the social housing development will have space in the ground floor where every week landless peasants will be able to sell low-cost organic produce to the members of the housing movement. So it's really, I think we're in the early stages in Sao Paulo in particular of a construction of a very different idea of what urban environmentalism looks like, based in non-market housing, owned and controlled by working class people and by people of color who are very much in dialogue with the broader environmental movement of the country. So that's one way of following the carbon in a kind of qualitative sense, identifying which actors are pushing for which kinds of climate policies in cities. But we can also follow carbon in a quantitative sense by doing things like carbon footprint mapping at the neighborhood level. Now, I'm not going to get into too many details. It would take a very long time, and I'm not sure how much this would be of interest to folks, but I've been doing this carbon footprint analysis at the neighborhood level, and I want to share with you some of the standout findings. In very brief terms, to do carbon footprint analysis at the neighborhood level, what you need to do is use multiple data sets to figure out where do the different households in the United States live, in which zip codes or census tracts, how much do they consume of what kinds of goods, And once we know what they consume, then we can figure out their carbon footprint, basically by multiplying their consumption by greenhouse gas coefficients. So we know on average how much each dollar of spent on a t-shirt creates in carbon emissions, for example, or how much each dollar is spent on gasoline, or how much each dollar is spent on plane tickets, and so on. So let's skip the details of the methodology, but the important point is simply that to do this work, you essentially have to do big data analysis of households at the neighborhood level. And what do we find? Well, we can go to New York City, for instance. Let's go to New York City and test the idea that density is always low carbon. This is a big idea in the United States, and it was expressed by David Owen in his book Green Metropolis in a very simple and elegant way. The future of real sustainability will look a lot more like Midtown Manhattan than rural Vermont. That is the claim of David Owen. The future of real sustainability will look a lot more like Midtown Manhattan than rural Vermont. That is the kind of claim that I think would resonate in almost every urban planning department in the country. We know that density, because people walk around and because people live in compact buildings that are more energy efficient, that is the way to decarbonize urban spaces, is through densification, full stop. Manhattan is the obvious example. Apartments on a bicycle, as the image of David Owen's book illustrates. Is that true? Is David Owen correct? Well, here's a map of New York City, building on data from my collaborator, Kevin Ummel. And the darkest shaded areas have the highest carbon footprints of the residents of those neighborhoods. Now, if you look at Manhattan, which is the sort of like little finger coming down, the darkest area on Manhattan is, you guessed it, Midtown, the Upper East Side, the Upper West Side, and the West Village. What you're seeing there is that, in fact, it is residents, the wealthiest residents of New York City, that have the highest carbon footprints. You can also see in this map, and I'll zoom in a little bit here, the golden dots are the New York City public housing. And you basically have, and so they're sort of spread throughout the city, but what you basically see is that the lowest carbon parts of New York City are not the wealthiest parts, but they are the neighborhoods that have a combination of density and access to public transit, a kind of crescent moon around Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, and the Bronx, that have public transit that are walkable, but that are working and middle class, that are often multiracial neighborhoods, often have a pretty good quality of life, and are often the most gentrified neighborhoods. They're becoming gentrified, and that also means that they're becoming more and more policed. If you wanted to defend, actually, the lowest carbon vision of New York City that has a pretty good quality of life with good social services, good transit access, what you would actually do is defend against gentrification by protecting affordable housing. And I would sort of summarize, in a sense, a basic finding here, that the lowest carbon neighborhoods that are also good to live in are the neighborhoods that have affordable housing as anchors, non-market affordable housing as anchors of those neighborhoods. That's where the emissions come down. And briefly, let's just look at what's going on here. Why is that the case? Well, if you look at gasoline emissions, then it is actually the more suburban, distant parts of New York that have the highest carbon footprint. If you look at utilities, they're pretty evenly spread across New York City. If you look at other transport, which in this case essentially means plane travel, boom, there it is. It's Manhattan and the wealthier parts of Brooklyn, where residents are taking the most plane trips. And this is actually robust all across Europe. In Europe, we find that the residents of downtown fly more often than comparably rich residents of suburbs do. And if you look at NYC other products, that's just like basic material consumption, again, enormous levels in Manhattan. What you're seeing here is the enormous carbon footprint of people in Manhattan who have, for instance, like multiple iPads, who are buying all kinds of stuff they probably don't need and don't use. In other words, it's not that people have low, I'm not advocating, and no one is advocating, that people should have low carbon footprints by being poor, but rather that there is a level of wealth that becomes so high that it really drives up emissions. And so when you look in total at emissions from New York City, you look at the territorial emissions, gasoline and utilities, and you look at the consumption emissions, plane travel and other products. And what you find essentially is that there are people who are so wealthy that the effects of density on reducing their emissions are completely canceled out by the impact of their very high levels of consumption. And so again, when we think of what is a model low carbon urban space, it does not make sense to think of places like Manhattan, which are essentially capitals of luxury consumption. And rather it makes sense to think of middle income, working class, multiracial neighborhoods where residents have fought for years to create things like basketball courts, libraries, schools, other public amenities of decent quality, which represent a far more sustainable urban form. And it suggests to us that actually the affordable housing anchored vision of sustainable urbanism is even more low carbon than the vision of green development for the middle and upper middle classes. So here's this map again. Now, I will just say a word, which is that in New York City, as well as in Sao Paulo, actually, if you want to look at the history of environmental policy, you will also see that the role of housing movements is surprisingly central. In April 2019, New York City passed the New York Climate Mobilization Act, often called New York City's Green New Deal. It was a bill to restrict affordable, it was a bill to cut buildings' carbon use by 40% by 2030. It's possibly the most aggressive low carbon buildings bill in the country. And what's really interesting about New York passing this bill in 2019 is that in 2009, 10 years earlier, Mike Bloomberg, when he was mayor of New York, tried to pass something almost identical, but he could not even get a vote in city council because the Real Estate Board of New York, the real estate industry, just completely resisted passing this bill. They had no desire to pass a bill that was going to force them, the real estate industry, to cut their own emissions through policies. So what happened? What happened is that after Hurricane Sandy, women like Rachel Rivera became involved in combining housing and climate activism. Rachel Rivera has a tragic story. She, on the night of Hurricane Sandy, heard a loud crack, woke up. She lived in a part of New York that was nowhere near any flooding. She lived in the Plunk in Crown Heights in the middle of the borough of Brooklyn. She woke up, she heard a crack. She ran into her daughter's room, grabbed her daughter out of bed. In a minute, just seconds after that, maybe 1 minute after that, the ceiling collapsed onto her daughter's bed under the storm waters. And basically what she was living on the top floor of a building owned by a slumlord who had done no maintenance. And essentially she was evicted during Hurricane Sandy by poverty. And her story is long and complex, and I won't get into every detail, but essentially she was evicted from her home by the storm. She ended up in the terrible New York City shelter system. Then she ended up in a midtown hotel put up by the city. And then as the city was trying to get rid of her out of this hotel, because the city has basically no good programming for tenants affected by natural disasters, she ran into New York City's housing movement, and in particular the New York Communities for Change movement. And so she got involved with this housing movement. They helped her get another apartment, and she became involved in two fights. On the one hand, fighting for housing rights in the boroughs of New York and fighting against climate change, which she learned was caused by fossil fuels. She developed this intense conviction that to help other people like her, to prevent them from being evicted, literally during storms, you had to defend people's housing rights to good quality housing, and you had to fight the fossil fuel industry. And Rachel became the spokesperson for the housing movement in the fight for New York's Green New Deal. This is a picture of Rachel at City Council on April 19th, 2019, when the New York Green New Deal passed. And she was more than anybody articulated this broad social housing demand that we should force buildings in New York City to cut their carbon emissions. But this was not in the Bloomberg proposal from 2009. In 2019, the bill also made sure that nobody's rent would be raised by the implications of this bill. So it's a complex bill. I'm not going to get into the details. And what's so important here is that because the housing movement was now involved in a way that it wasn't in 2009, the housing movement put an enormous amount of pressure on New York City councilors, basically said, if you cave into the real estate industry, we will make sure you don't get reelected. We will primary you. They put a ton of pressure in particular on the city council president, Corey Johnson. And as a result of that, the housing movement led the organizing that got New York City to pass its nationally leading low carbon buildings bill, which is just an enormous accomplishment. And I will say this very day in city council, I don't have a picture of it, I was sitting in the gallery, the city councilor, Costa Constantinidis, who was the person who introduced the bill, this New York low carbon buildings bill, what he said very much reflected Rachel Rivera's activism. Costa said on the floor of city council, he said, we have to pass this bill to make sure that no mother goes to sleep at night worried that her family will be displaced by rising seas or by rising rents. And I think of that phrase as marking a kind of seismic shift in American climate politics, where the idea is finally established that eviction is as much of an existential crisis for a working class family or a low income family as climate change. Climate change is the existential crisis in the long term. In the short term, the existential crisis is eviction. And in Rachel Rivera's case, the only thing that made Sandy such a devastating event for her was that she had a slumlord who wasn't maintaining her home in good conditions. It wasn't the rising sea, it was the neglect and disinvestment of a predatory landlord. So you see now in New York City kind of a fusion of housing movement politics led again in New York as in Sao Paulo by women of color and the politics of climate change. Now, let me just throw one last set of ideas at you. I'm gonna skip a long conversation about Red Vienna because of time and say that we've done some more kind of quantitative carbon footprint analysis. And essentially what the upshot of this analysis, just very quickly, is that we are finding that when we're talking about climate vulnerability, things like heat waves, what is really important is not just the outdoor temperature, the outdoor threat of climate change, but as we saw with Rachel Rivera's story, the intersection of climate change and the poor housing conditions that many low-income families face. And I promised I would talk for a minute about policy, and so I'm going to talk about the Green New Deal for Public Housing Act, which was an effort to tackle at the same time the very poor conditions of public housing, as well as the problem of carbon emissions. Public housing emits carbon, as does all housing, but 15% of US carbon emissions come from housing. So I led the research for the Green New Deal for Public Housing Act introduced by AOC and Senator Bernie Sanders. And to produce it, we did a couple of things. We did on the ground research in NYCHA. We talked to largely women who are living in apartments that are in very bad shape because of decades of government neglect. We held meetings with residents of NYCHA in NYCHA, New York City Housing Authority buildings, to talk about their needs. And I'll tell you that they were not so much focused on carbon emissions per se, but they were very excited about the idea that they could get new appliances that would be all electric, that the air in their apartments would be cleaner, that they could have a greener public housing complexes that would also be much healthier at the same time. So they were very excited about this intersectional policy approach. And we also did quantitative analysis, pulling out data sets and finding that actually, yes, conditions in New York public housing are much, much worse than they are in apartments in the rest of the city. And the public housing residents are much more likely to be Black or Latino. And maybe there isn't actually a coincidence there at all. But you have in NYCHA apartments in New York public housing over double the rate of water leakage compared to the New York average, double the rate of toilet breakdown, over double the rate of heating breakdown, well over double the rate of cockroach infestation. And so no wonder you have worse health conditions because of government neglect. And so the solution then, the Green New Deal idea, is to tackle all these problems at once with a massive federal grant campaign that would bring public investment into public housing, and by virtue of doing that, bring investment into communities of color, bring good green jobs into working class communities and communities of color that lack work. In New York City, of course, in cities around the country, as well as in rural areas where there's a lot of public housing that has rural, poor white residents who also desperately need their housing to be upgraded and to have jobs themselves doing that work. So I will just say briefly, in terms of what this housing would do, it's the idea is a big grant program that tackles the problem of carbon and the problem of poor living conditions at the same time, and that empowers residents to control the retrofit process, to have a big say over the retrofit process, and to ensure that the majority of jobs retrofitting the public housing goes to public housing residents and other low-income workers in that community, creating hundreds of thousands of jobs, reducing carbon pollution by millions of metric tons every year, and of course, slashing the utility costs faced by public housing authorities, and then ultimately creating the legal basis for expanding new public housing that would be built to the highest energy efficiency standards. So let me just wrap up with a final thought here. I think often in conversations around environmental justice or in social policy, there is a concern that focusing on carbon will distract from focusing on social, racial, economic inequalities. And what I've tried to demonstrate today, moving very quickly through a large number of cases, is that if you follow the carbon into the viscera of social life, that following the carbon will help you see in an intersectional way the relationships between climate injustice, climate breakdown, and social, racial, political inequality. That following the carbon doesn't have to be a distraction from the everyday problems that people face, but in fact, we can if we set up the research in the right way, we can learn to see all of these problems as fundamentally connected. And I think there's an analogy, actually, and I've used this word intersectionality a lot. There's an analogy to how we're increasingly learning to understand social inequalities in a more intersectional way. The great Caribbean intellectual Stuart Hall once said that race is the modality through which class is lived. And I think by analogy, we can say that colonialism and racial capitalism are the modalities through which climate change is lived. We can't separate our analysis and understanding of climate change from our analysis of colonialism, of racial capitalism. And I hope to have shown some elements of that today. And that indeed, by following the carbon, we can look out at the 21st century city, in this case, Sao Paulo. And that looking from the perspective of carbon, seeing through the lens of carbon, does not occlude or obscure social inequalities, but actually gives us a sharper sense of the struggles before us to create livable, healthy, accessible, low carbon cities that are built from below by working class people, by racialized communities, and that is actually the path to climate justice and to sustainability. So thank you very much. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Well, Daniel, thank you so much for weaving together so many concerns from the UEP angle on housing, on activism, on climate change. And, you know, I love the way you invoked Stuart Hall's ideas there to tie all this together. We do have a lot of questions. Do you want the easy ones first, or do you want the hard ones?
Let's do it the UEP way.
Let's do it the UEP way. Okay, I'm going to just jump straight in and be very fair about this. The first question came in from the Brown House Watch group. Brown House is our UEP base, and there's a group of people watching there. How does the carbon footprint of Manhattan compare with the footprint of other US cities?
Thanks. So overall, we know that wealthier people have higher carbon footprints. The other interesting thing is that a lot of cities that pat themselves on the back for being low carbon, liberal, amazing cities, actually what they have is an accounting identity. So the way that most cities count their overall carbon footprint is they simply draw a line around the city, they add up all the emissions that occur physically inside, and then they include the emissions from the electricity. Okay, so far, so good. But what do they not include? They don't include emissions from the airports. They don't include the emissions that result from consumption. That is extremely convenient if your model of economic development is to send all the factories to other parts of the world. New York City actually used to be the biggest manufacturing city in the United States until bankers and oil people like the Rockefellers made a deliberate strategy to offshore that industrial activity to other places. So when you take sort of wealthy, affluent cities that have done a consumption footprint at the city level, and New York City hasn't, you tend to find that the carbon footprint from the consumption footprint from those cities is about 2 to 4 times bigger than the emissions that occur inside of the territories. So Seattle is an example of this. London is an example of this. San Francisco is an example where 80% of the carbon emissions caused by in-city activity occur outside of city limits. There's one table in one New York City carbon inventory report from 2009, where at the very end of the report, and someone on Twitter actually pointed me to this, so Twitter is research. There's one line where New York City estimated the emissions from its 2 in-city airports, LaGuardia and JFK, which basically take the total emissions from all the flights and you cut them in half. You attribute half of that to the city. And when they did that, they found that the number of emissions attributable to the air travel to and from New York was equivalent to the emissions from all of New York City's buildings. So you will hear over and over, oh, it's all about the buildings. Well, it's not just about the buildings. So I think what you do with consumption footprinting has to be kind of complex, but it is just a rule of thumb that wealthy, liberal, post-industrial cities, such as like most of the liberal cities we know of in the United States, cause far more carbon emissions than they typically count through their territorial footprints. And that is very convenient for them. And I am very skeptical when we hear stories about the low carbon virtue of places like Manhattan, when really it is just a form of environmental privilege, which is to not have to live amidst the pollution caused by your own activity.
Right, that's quite a statement to make to some who've just absorb this kind of this norm, this idea that yeah, that's a great point. Another question slightly related, and you've kind of addressed this. Do you have any suggestions for what cities should be doing to address the displacement that has been caused by green improvements?
Thanks. I mean, I would almost just love to hear your answer, Julian, because I know you've worked on this quite a bit as well. I'm a member of the Homes Guarantee Campaign's policy team. This is like a national tenants movement, and we've been trying to incorporate the environment and climate change in every aspect of the policy. And I think that surprisingly, maybe to some in the environmental movement or environmental community, I would say the single most important thing to prevent displacement from green improvement is rent control. There's a lot actually that the environmental movement has thrown aside as old-fashioned social policy, but it's actually good social policy. The issue is in a hot land market, which is the case in most US cities and in many large cities around the world, if you put green improvement into a neighborhood, then it will make that neighborhood more desirable and it's going to raise prices. Some of the hottest neighborhoods in New York City are environmental justice communities: Harlem, Williamsburg, Sunset Park. They were cleaned up by residents of color who fought very hard. And now the real estate industry has said, oh, wait a minute, that looks like a great place to build a condo tower. Thank you very much. We're going to take it. And so strategies to prevent that kind of displacement, a big one is going to be rent control so that the rent doesn't go up. But I think another one is building new non-market housing. Michelle Wu, a city councilor in Boston, has a Green New Deal plan for Boston. And her strategy for this is community land trusts, which is a form of non-market housing governed by the community. That makes sense in Boston, which has the Dudley Street Community Land Trust, probably the best known community land trust in the country. In Baltimore, a slightly different strategy, but in a lot of ways similar, is to say, well, in Baltimore does not have such a hot land market. There's still speculation. But in Baltimore, there are a lot of vacant homes that aren't occupied or that are being left abandoned by speculative real estate owners. And so the movement there is to buy up at low cost these vacant homes, do a green retrofit, bring them up to code, make them energy efficient, and then govern those again through a community land trust. And that's a model that we're looking at very closely in Philly. But I think the gold standard would be constructing millions and millions of new units of green social housing built to the highest energy efficiency standards and in neighborhoods all across cities around the country. The best social housing in the world is in Vienna, and it was built from the very start in every single zip code in the city on the principle that no one should know from your zip code what your social situation is. And of course, over time that has leveled up so that Vienna is a quite an equal city with very, very, very high quality social housing.
Well, hold that Vienna thought, because we actually do have somebody from Vienna who's asked a question, but I just wanted to reiterate this point about affordable housing. I mean, Dan Immergluck, who is a planner economist at Georgia Tech, has come up with exactly your point. I mean, he's been looking at the Atlanta Beltline, and he basically says, affordable housing, robust policies for affordable housing before green improvements, not during green improvements, but before. So I think, rent controls, and isn't New York looking at rent controls? I know Cambridge and Boston are looking at rent control again, but New York, where are they on that?
Yeah, so New York State, often, of course, the trick of American federalism is that they empower states, not cities, and it's a trap that has been used to wield it against communities of color in cities for a very long time, obviously. New York State, so what's happened actually interesting is the New York State housing movement realized they had to organize statewide. And so last year they passed a very powerful kind of set of rental protection laws that really firmed up rent regulated apartments. But the next step is to expand rent control to cover more properties than it does now. So that fight is ongoing, but I think the biggest innovation in New York has not been maybe the policy, which is good policy, it's fine, but has been the recognition that only statewide political action is going to work. And I think in this political moment, that's very powerful because there is a temptation for many to retreat to progressive cities as a kind of enclave or fortress mentality. But the fact is that you can't really get anything done if you take up that position.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to call on Florian Zach. Florian, if you're still on the line, would you like to ask your question to Daniel? You live in Vienna, apparently, and you'd be interested in... Florian, there you are.
Hey, nice to be here.
Good.
So yeah, I think it's nice to get an outside perspective to the city you live in. And when you live here, you probably have a different view on the things. So my question was, I would be so interested on what the presentation actually says about Vienna, as I experienced probably a different way, or maybe I can agree with what the presentation says. So maybe this question can be answered.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm always interested, so I spent a few days in Vienna a couple of years ago, and I've done some reading on the historical conditions for the rise of Red Vienna. So for folks who don't know, Vienna in the 20s and 30s was often known as Red Vienna. It was governed by the Social Democratic Party. Basically, the left in Vienna has pretty much won every election, as far as I understand, since the First World War. Obviously, they lost the Civil War to the fascists during the 1930s. But when the left came into power in Vienna in the 1920s, they imposed very high real estate taxes, such high taxes that it was possible to then buy up a bunch of property to build social housing on. The causes for this are like somewhat complex. And my understanding, and again, please correct me if I'm wrong, is that Vienna decided to do a lot of its social policy through social housing construction. So the idea was you'd build new social housing and you would put all kinds of amenities into that housing. The jewel of this program was the Karl Marx Hof, literally named for Karl Marx, hosted thousands of residents. And among its amenities, dental clinic, laundry, childcare, community, theater space, all that kind of thing. There was even a city-run interior design firm that was set up to help residents have good quality interior furnishings of their own apartments. So it's really a sort of transformative vision of high quality working class life in housing. And this will be painful to some of you, but the level of rent set for tenants of this new social housing was set to be about 3% of the average semi-skilled worker's salary. 3%. In the United States, we consider rent burdensome only starting at 30% of your income. And there it was set at 3%. And this social housing construction continued to this day. If I'm not mistaken, about 2/3 of Vienna's housing stock is off the market. A big chunk of that is public housing. A big chunk of it is cooperatives, which is another way that the housing has been built. And again, my understanding and from visiting is that the quality is high and that there continues to be innovation. Some projects are better than others, but and I guess the last thing I'll say quickly on this, something I learned in reading the history, which really fascinated me, is that there's a cliche that, the left, Stalinists want to build the worst quality housing. It's always going to be so terrible and so ugly, like in the Soviet Union. Well, in 1934, the Brookings Institute, which is American centrist think tank in Washington, D.C., went to Vienna and they said, this spectacular social housing is a terrible waste of money. And they should have instead built concrete shacks in the suburbs for workers and used the money that they built on social housing doing something more useful. So I think that actually teaches us an important lesson about whose agenda is going to yield what kind of quality. And the Viennese model of really good architects building very nice social housing at a good cost, at a good quality is something we should all know more about. I'm sure that there are problems with it in Vienna, but for an outsider from North America, it's a bit mind-boggling.
And we have to remember as well, love them or hate them, Vienna is regularly at the top of the world livability tables, beating out Vancouver, Sydney, Melbourne. So there's something going on. Florian, do you want to have quickly the last word on this?
Yeah, sure. I'd love to. So what I can say from living in different districts in Vienna, you actually can, by looking at certain districts, say that there are more wealthy people living in few districts, for example, with its 23 districts, and the 18th district, the 19th district, these are more for wealthy people. The first district is mainly inhabited by wealthy people. The 10th district, so there is a little bit of inequality. So there are certain districts where more people living with low income, and there are districts where people have a rather high income, as there are more houses and less condominium. So I couldn't agree with everything that was said, but as always in life, it's the diversity and makes life interesting. So, but we can do better, I think, in Vienna, and yeah, there's always room to improvement, I would say. But 3% of the income, that's not happening anymore. So people are paying a lot more than 3% for housing. So for me personally, it's way more than that. Many people pay more than 50% of their income meanwhile. So it's not that easy anymore in Vienna too.
Great, thanks, Florian. Shifting to air travel, if air travel is such a significant contributor to carbon emissions, shouldn't there also be a large policy emphasis placed on reducing business travel? Doesn't quite fit the context of the Green New Deal, but seems important.
Yeah, I think the issue of air travel is a big one, and it's complex. And the emissions that I'm showing are from leisure travel, not business travel. The business travel would not show up in the carbon footprint analysis that way. Reducing air travel for businesses would be great. I mean, we can only dream that a silver lining from COVID is that we learn to do virtual convenings better. My university, the University of Pennsylvania, has shockingly few classrooms that are set up for like a truly immersive virtual experience. I think every university can do a better job in making sure that like virtual visits and so on are as comfortable as possible. I think the other question that's raised is the question of leisure and region. Historically, if you look at the early to mid 20th century, all around the world, in developing countries and in wealthier countries, you have the kind of development of working class regional leisure. So you can even think of things like Coney Island in New York or Atlantic City. You often have like big kind of worker colonies on the beaches in like Latin America, for instance. And this was an idea that it was like an emancipatory thing to be able to go down to the beach, take the train and spend a few days there. I think today those spots are often culturally stigmatized. You know, we think of Atlantic City or of some of the like upstate New York State tourism and something is for like the poors. We don't really like it. We don't pay, there's no infrastructure devoted to it, no funding. And I would say that I think one way of thinking about the problem of air travel is to say, well, what if we invested in low carbon regional leisure? We could do that. We could have electric buses that could go around the state. We have already existing like public, state parks with campsites where you can stay. You could have an expansion of affordable, accessible leisure options in the region that don't require hopping on the plane. So I think the most exciting place to go from carbon footprint analysis isn't to sell austerity, but to just be more creative in thinking about forms of non-resource intensive affluence, or what I sometimes call public luxury. And when one thinks about leisure, you can just go back to earlier in the 20th century and see many, many really interesting examples of public transit into public shared spaces outside of the city where working class people had a great time, and we should valorize those experiences and those cultures rather than stigmatize them.
Okay, Daniel, I think last question. Given the need to understand and address social and environmental justice issues simultaneously, to what extent do you see institutional capacity as a barrier to intersectional climate planning and policy? Do you see the charge being led solely by social movements and civic organizations, or are public sector actors also playing a role in connecting these struggles?
Thanks. Yeah, I think that is a great question. I mean, I would circle back extremely briefly to Vienna to say, I appreciate what Florian said, and we don't live in the 1920s anymore, obviously. But it's certainly true that, Vienna builds good quality social housing. It's built by the government and they do a good job. And one might wonder, could an American city turn that over overnight? And the answer, of course, is no. So I think the question is a really interesting one. What do we do in the US to rebuild the public sector so that it can actually deliver for working class people and people of color in a way that it hasn't really been so far? I was involved in a lot of public polling in the run up to the last election. And it's pretty clear that a vast majority of Americans support most of the things, for instance, that Bernie Sanders proposed. But they voted for Joe Biden in the primaries. And I think probably the most realistic assessment of why that is that they wanted the kinds of changes that we talked about with the Green New Deal, but they didn't trust that the public sector was actually able to deliver them in the short term. They didn't see it as a plausible short-term option. So I think if we want to get to the kinds of places that a lot of us want to go to, we actually do need a strategy that is somewhat incremental, that's saying, here are the things we can build right away. Here's how we're going to build trust. Here's how we're going to build institutional capacity. And I think we probably need to be creative. And I think this is why the community land trust idea is so good. We don't want to reproduce all the forms of public investment and control that we had after World War II. We don't want to have people in Washington, D.C. planning every single city in the country. I think we want to think about how can we have nimble, responsive public institutions that are responsive to local concerns. Sometimes you have to bulldoze local concerns. That's states' rights was a right-wing idea, remember, to prevent emancipation really from racism. So we have to be flexible, but I do think that's right. There needs to be a kind of good governance conversation and a conversation about how to effectively increase public institutional capacity. So the social movements are doing great work, but for the government to respond to them will not be automatic. It will take a lot of work.
Okay, so very last, Daniel, I want you to leave us with a thought. One of our students has said, I'm moving to Vienna. My thesis advisee, Miranda, not until you finish your thesis, okay? But Daniel, the question is, urban planning, urban policy students, enthusiastic, practical visionaries, what one thing could they do in their professional life that would further this agenda?
It's a really good question. I mean, I think I have to be on brand here and say that the kind of green affordable housing sector is growing, and it could use like your work and contributions. You have in Pennsylvania already, you're now able to build low-income housing tax credit, affordable housing. It's not a great model, it's what exists. At a passive house standard for about roughly the same cost as conventional. So it's hugely better for the long term to build passive house. You have a lot of interesting projects in New York, projects like Via Verde in the Bronx, that were very creative use of philanthropic and government tax credits to build a spectacular, very sustainable, affordable housing project. I think that more talent going into, whether it's on the architectural side, figuring out how to build low carbon social housing, and that's important in the United States, but it's important in Europe, it's important in Latin America, it's important all over the world. And then the other piece, so there's the construction piece, then there is the whole like policy shift piece. And whether that's in like a more social movement, civil society space, or it's working through government agencies, we need people who are taking like the very nice pilot projects of essentially green affordable housing and really, really dramatically scaling up the production, the spread, and revising and improving these models to meet the needs of folks in communities. So I think there is right now an existing kind of green affordable housing space. And I would say the more people in it of like talent and of motivation and who have ideals of social justice who enter that space, the more quickly we'll transform how we literally live in this world and for the better.
Daniel, thanks so much for this. Can we give either by a show of hands or by the emoji or whatever it is, can we just show our appreciation for Daniel? Great. Daniel, again, thanks, and good luck with this work, and let's keep in touch.
Thank you. Thanks so much for the chance to speak with all of your brilliant students and with you, Julian. It's been too long.
Great. Been too long, Daniel. Yeah, we'll catch up. Okay. Bye, everybody. See you at the next forum.